Wrestling with God, episode number 28.
Oh, I turned my headphones up, man. Take off your Bluetooth. We about to take it past the roof. Wrestling with God to find the truth. It's so mind-blowing and the facts are bulletproof. Tune in and connect direct, cause this sets demand respect. We ain't even tripping, the most intriguing podcast on iTunes. Float with the word like a balloon. Oh, yeah.
Welcome back to another episode of the Wrestling with God podcast. I'm your host, Scott Blair. This is the first episode of the new year. I pretty much tried to take the holidays off from podcasting, and I hope you enjoyed your holidays as much as I enjoyed mine. I also hope you missed us a little bit. Very excited about the new year. I really am, and I know that it used to be cool to have New Year's resolutions, and I guess now it seems like it's not. And I guess now I'm noticing the cool thing to say is I don't make New Year's resolutions. I'm always working on myself year-round. Don't wait until the new year. Well, I'm always working on myself too, but I still love the new year. I love that feeling. I love the idea of the fresh start and moving into the future and a new year. I don't care. It feels like a reset to me, and I love it, and I'm going to maximize it. And I don't know about you, but I do plan on accomplishing some great things this year. I just believe it for this year, plain and simple. And you know what? I'd like to know what you're believing for this year. Shoot me an email. Shoot me a tweet. Let me know somehow. A ministry project that you're working on, something for the kingdom, maybe a book that you're writing. Maybe we could even have you on the show and interview you. Now, speaking about believing something, our first sponsor today would like to challenge you on that very thing. They are asking, are you ready to take your life back with the same childlike faith you had when you were young? Childlike faith is the only faith that gets 100% results. In the book of Job, chapter 22, verse 28, it says, "Thou shalt also decree a thing, and it shall be established unto thee, and the light shall shine upon thy ways." Also in the book of Matthew, chapter 21, verse 22, it says, "In all things whatsoever ye shall ask in prayer, believing you shall receive." If you would like to have your childlike faith restored, be sure to visit this blog of our sponsor, which has many powerful, focused prayers that will bless you, and you will also be blessed with life-changing Christian affirmations and so much more. It is at ibelievereceive.org/WordPress/child-like-faith. Or if you want to make it easier, just go to ibelievereceive.org/WordPress and then search for childlike faith, and the links will pop up there. Reminding you that we can have what we say when we do not doubt in our heart and we believe with what we say lines up with the Word of God. In Jesus' name, amen. Jesus is Lord. I believe that. I believe if it lines up with the Word of God and you don't doubt, we can have whatever we believe and ask for. And it's interesting that they are our first sponsor of the year, and I'm going to be checking them out more, especially because of these biblical affirmations. It's something I talked about in my last book, Born to Raise Hell, when I talked about building the God esteem over the self-esteem. And in that book, I offer a technique and the scriptures to use for those affirmations to start loving yourself the way God does. And this site is doing things that are very similar. And I have also been studying prayer and faith over the last few months for my next book project. And one of the things that I've added in my morning routine is 5 minutes of these biblical affirmations. So I too might be finding some interesting stuff over on that blog from today's sponsor. And our second sponsor today is a repeat, and I love repeat sponsors because it means they support this show and the listeners of this show are supporting them. And our second sponsor today is Jackie Gomesia, And she believes that everybody has a spiritual battle, but some are not even aware of it. So she has developed a course for everyone, especially those with chronic challenges. It's also meant for those who are living with problems that just don't ever seem to go away. And most of her students are people who have tried all other methods like counseling. They've sought out some medical help. But they're just not finding a solution anywhere. So once again, she's offering access to her course on spiritual warfare for 50% off for our listeners. So you get that $16 course for just $8. It's a Udemy course. It's located at udemy.com. That's udemy.com/spiritual-warfare. You just got to put a little coupon code in there. It should still work. Holiday Sale 2014. And she really believes that this class is going to help you reach your full potential in 2015. And I know you'll get a lot out of this class. She's put a lot into making sure that you grow spiritually from it. It's got some pretty good reviews again. So the address again is udemy.com/spiritual-warfare. And the coupon code is Holiday 2014. Make sure you take advantage of that, Grapplers Church listeners. And Jackie, shout out to you. I did see you on the CBN, the Christian Broadcast Network, a little video about your testimony. That was really powerful. I was glad I stumbled onto that and found that friend of the show. Very excited about today's show. It is very timely as well. We are 1 month from tomorrow from the 50 Shades of Grey movie hitting theaters, just in time for Valentine's Day. So millions of you men will be forced to watch it with your significant other as part of this annual celebration of Amor and Diapered Angels, I guess. So ladies, if you're listening, I got a question for you. Are you going to go to this movie? Are you going to ask your man to take you? Afterwards, let's be honest, are you going to buy some S&M products? As a Christian, do you think you should feel guilty about reading this book or going to this film? Should you feel guilty? Is this sexy? Is this perverted? Are you messed up in the head, or is the church a bunch of old prunes? Well, we had a lot of fun tackling this topic on today's show, and I hope that you gain a really healthy and godly perspective from this interview. But I won't keep you from it any longer, Grapplers Church fam. Let's grab a hold of God and not let go. Well, 50 Shades of Grey is a publishing and actually cultural phenomenon. I'm sure that you have at least heard about it at this point. The series has sold over 100 million books, entering the all-time top 10 selling book list. At the peak of its popularity, one book was being sold every second somewhere in the world. That is just mind-blowing to me. Crushing records set by the Da Vinci Code and Harry Potter, and now it's up there in the top 10 with the likes of Charles Dickens and C.S. Lewis, which somewhat bothers me because I haven't heard that this book is a very well-written book. I saw a lot of reviews on Amazon that people were saying, did a teenager write this? But though these healthy book sales, if you will, have also spiked the online sale of whips, chains, and other BDSM-related paraphernalia. And so some dare to question, how healthy is a superdose of sexual fantasy like this for readers? And when does sexual fantasy cross the line from healthy to harmful? And of course, then there's the question that we would ask here on this podcast, should this be something that women of faith should be entertaining and reading and so on? So it's kind of easy to conceal the fact that you are reading this book because the way things are now with Kindles and tablets, a lot of women who may not have purchased this and carried it with them for being afraid of being caught or ashamed of being caught with this book are now able to have it on this digital device and kind of avoid that shame and still partake in it. So today we will be talking with best-selling author, speaker, and counselor Shannon Ethridge. And Shannon has written a book to kind of answer some of these questions that we're just talking about and other questions actually about sexual fantasy. And the book she wrote is The Fantasy Fallacy, Exposing the Deeper Meaning Behind Sexual Thoughts. Shannon, welcome to the show. And are you ready to wrestle with God?
I am indeed, Scott. Thanks so much for having me on today.
Well, let's start off a little bit by educating our readers about you. I want you to tell them anything you want about yourself professionally and personally, kind of what made you write this book or want to touch on this topic. And also what I'd like to address is because, I probably will have a split in the audience here. And I know a lot of women, obviously, if we're selling one a second worldwide, a lot of women have read this, including women of faith and including women who are going to be listening to this show. And I know some of the things that you or I might say today might upset them a little bit because they're really big fans of this series of books. So I want to kind of touch the fact that I don't want them shutting down because they think that you are just a simple backwoods preacher kind of woman. Who has no academic and just wants to condemn this to the fiery pits of hell.
Yeah, that's
kind
not
of
my
attitude.
goal at all. Yeah.
Okay. And then and then the others who say well, I don't know her approach from faith. She just sounds like some type of educated psychologist. So explain to them why you wrote the book and what your balance is on that topic, I guess.
Okay, well, to give you a little bit of history, over a decade ago, I wrote the Every Woman's Battle series alongside Stephen Arterburn and Fred Stoker's Every Man's Battle series. And so it was all about sexual integrity and especially for women, emotional integrity as well. And then I evolved into another book called The Sexually Confident Wife because I'm not just passionate about sexual integrity. I'm also passionate about sexual intimacy within marriage. And then most recently have written The Passion Principles about celebrating sexual freedom in marriage. And then, like you mentioned, the fantasy fallacy. And so all along, I have had a fascination with the fact that all sexual temptation and sexual intimacy starts in our minds. And I think that God wired our minds in some really interesting ways. And I have a master's degree in counseling and human relations from Liberty University. And in my human sexuality class in particular, I learned so much, just really opened my mind to the miraculous wonders of how God wired our brain. And for years, I had been wanting to write a book on sexual fantasy, but in all honesty, it's one of those titles that, Christian publishers wouldn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. But I did finally convince Thomas Nelson to let me do this book. And actually, I had the Passion Principles coming down the pike when I heard about the 50 Shades of Grey phenomenon. And so I asked, can we put the Passion Principles on hold and let me write the fantasy fallacy? And they said, only if you can do it in 60 days. And so I gathered up all my research materials, all my notes from the past 10 years of coaching women and couples through their sexual experiences and their sexual fantasies, and just went into writing sabbatical mode. And I actually got that book written in 40 days. And I just really sensed God saying, see, Shannon, when you're pregnant with something that long, it really doesn't take that much pushing to get it out. I felt as if it was certainly a message that had been longing to be birthed out of my spirit for quite some time. And so let me just go on the record, Scott. I didn't write the book to condemn the series. And I obviously had to read them. I couldn't write a book in response to a cultural phenomenon that I knew nothing about. I wasn't going to just stick my head in the sand and pretend like I knew what I was talking about. And so I'm not as concerned about whether or not people read the books or not, or see the movie or not. What I'm most interested in is putting a filter in their minds so that they can properly process what's healthy fantasy and what is unhealthy fantasy and what's destructive fantasy. Because the last thing that I want to do is see this cultural phenomenon destroy people's integrity and destroy couples' intimacy.
Well, that's very impressive, the 40 days to be able to put that book out or put it together. And of course, the biblical number of 40, you completed it in.
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty biblical number too.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
Christian women are so afraid that I'm going to judge or condemn them for having read the book. And heavens no, I mean, I don't have a stone to throw at anyone for anything with my past. Good grief. But, and again, I had to read it too. I just simply want them to interpret this properly and still be able to look at their life through God's lens rather than through a 50 Shades lens. It really shocked me when I heard that there were several hotel chains in Europe that were replacing the Gideon's Bible with 50 Shades of Grey in their hotel rooms.
Wow.
It's like, oh, wait a minute. As a society, we can't get so carried away with all this that we lose sight of what's important to us. And I think that is taking our thoughts captive and making them obedient to Christ. Now, that doesn't mean that we'll never have thoughts. It doesn't mean that we'll never be aroused by certain thoughts. It simply means that we're taking them captive and we're channeling all the sexual energy that they create into our marriage bed. Even Jesus himself had sexual thoughts and feelings. There's nothing sinful about a thought or a feeling. It's what you do with it. And so I just want to equip women with the right discernment on how are you going to respond to this if you do choose to read it.
Okay, well, we'll get into the thoughts and the fantasies and the process there, the filter you want to install. But let's just keep on the book for a minute.
Okay.
What is the big deal? I mean, I haven't read it. You have.
Yeah.
But I'm reading these 6,000 negative reviews on Amazon, and I've read other places where it's said not to be a well-written book.
Yeah, it's not a literary masterpiece unless you consider the expression "holy cow" to be like deeply profound because she uses it so much.
Yeah, one of the reviews said like if you took out, the holy cow, the biting the lips, the all this other stuff, you might have 50 pages of a story left.
Yeah.
And I thought that was funny, but what do you think it is? What is it, and why are women going crazy over it?
Well, I have to be honest. I think that there has been such a void of healthy information about female sexuality for so long that the only place that a woman has had to turn to really learn about female sexuality is to porn. And that's a really sad statement, but what pastor do you know of that's preaching about female sexual intimacy and sexual integrity from the pulpit? And what pastor's wife or women's ministry leader has been bold enough to put her neck on that chopping block? And I think that's the reason that I've been so successful over the past 15 to 20 years of speaking on this topic is because pastors and women's ministry leaders don't want to speak on it themselves for fear of offending and shocking. However, they will bring me in. And then if somebody gets mad, they can throw a stone at me and I'm out the back door and it doesn't matter. So,
right.
So it's just, I think that the fact that it was packaged as a mainstream book. I mean, I was walking through airports and literally book stands are set up out in the hallway of this trilogy and luring people in to purchase them. And it's like, kids could just come by and pick up this book just strolling through the airport. It was just so made readily available and glamorized. And I think that women are just rather titillated by the storyline. And I think that it's mainly for one primary reason is that there's danger. There's a forbidden element. There's definitely the being wooed and pursued by the dangerous bad boy. And she brings it to an ending with the hearts and flowers. Her love did save him and they lived happily ever after. But the reality is that relationships that start out this way and that are conducted this way with intense manipulation, control, abuse, violence, they don't usually have hearts and flower endings. And so it really did concern me when I saw that sales of whips and chains are skyrocketing and women are, I think, becoming even more predatory than ever before, looking for the type of intensity that they see in this novel. And they're exchanging genuine, healthy intimacy for that dangerous intensity. And that usually doesn't end well.
Yeah, and one of the things from the little bit that I've pulled out from the reviews I've been reading and some different articles is I'm kind of shocked, and I guess maybe from the male perspective, I want to go, double standard on several issues that are kind of jumping out at me. And one of them is, and not that that's going to win or change anything, but I just found it a very interesting side note that this main character, I guess his name is Christian Grey, mm-hmm. He learned that, and you correct me on names and stuff if
sure,
you know, and
sure.
I say them wrong.
I'll jump in.
But he learned this behavior by being seduced into a sexual relationship with a friend of his adoptive mother's, and he was 15 years old.
And she was much older.
And she was a dominatrix, and he was the submissive.
Yes.
And that's, sexually abusive. That's sexual abuse when you have a child with an older married woman like that.
Sure.
And the thing that I found shocking was when I thought about this, as soon as I read this, if I wrote that book in the reverse,
right,
and
You'd
there was a 15-year-old girl
mm-hmm.
that we talked about blindfolding and whipping and all these things by an older, much older married man. Well, it's just, I think the culture as a whole would find that revolting.
There would be such an outcry. And Scott, it actually goes even deeper than that. And I will tip my hat to the author for one thing that she did. I do think that she properly researched the psychology of sexual fantasies, because it goes even deeper than the fact that he was lured into a sexual relationship with a much older dominatrix, in that when he was very, very young, his mother was a prostitute and she was stoned out of her gourd most of the time. And her pimp would frequently physically abuse him. And so he grew up with a lot of anger toward his mother. And he's had 15 of these BDSM type of relationships with 15 different women prior to meeting the heroine of the story, Anna Steele, I think is her name. But the thing that all these 15 women have in common is that they look exactly like his mother. And in other words, he's trying to recreate a scenario in order to win this time. Sexual fantasy is just the brain's way of trying to medicate a previous trauma. And so you can envision how much anxiety, how much anger, how much fury is pent up in this, relatively young man. I think he's like 26 or 27. Over his mother issues, and he is acting all that negative emotion out in very violent and destructive ways with other women. And the fact that he lures Anna into this sexual relationship when she was only, I think, 21, had just graduated college, was a virgin. He has sex with her the first time, just the plain, straight, vanilla way, like she's always envisioned losing her virginity. But before that happens, he has her sign a gag order. It's a confidentiality agreement that she can't discuss their relationship with anybody at all. So she has no one to turn to process okay, this is what's going on. He has a red room of pain with a bunch of whips and chains and nipple clamps and all kinds of, really perverted, painful gadgets. And he wants to use those on me. What do you think? And so, putting her in isolation, there's so many layers of control and manipulation and abuse to this storyline that it is absolutely shocking.
Well, let's drill down on that a little bit. For those who have kind of read the books and enjoyed them and maybe not have looked at them from this type of stance, why is this relationship between Christian and Anna not good? Why is it like a not good role model for young women or any woman for that matter, as fantasy or reality?
Well, I think the main thing that it touches on is women's misconception that my love will save him. My love will change him. The reality is you don't change a man unless he's in diapers. And the idea that she can tame him, that she can harness all this energy, and it's a very unrealistic portrayal of what usually happens when you're involved with a man with these types of violent tendencies. And I also think that another reason, Scott, that even Christian women, especially Christian women, are drawn to this storyline is, again, sexual fantasy is the brain's way of trying to heal itself from past trauma. Well, something that Christian women experience growing up in families of origin that are very conservative, even some to the point of being legalistic, is they hear over and over, good girls don't, good girls don't. And it's really hard for them to put the wedding band on their finger and switch gears from good girls don't to good girls do. They do it often. They do it well. They enjoy it. There's no guilt, shame, or inhibition. You're just told that good girls don't. And so one of the most popular themes in female, romance novels is for the heroine to be raped. Because if she's raped, she's not exchanging her good girl identity for a bad girl identity because it wasn't her choice. It wasn't her fault. She's merely a victim. So the way that this story is set up is that Anna is very much victimized, but she doesn't seem to see herself as that. And I think that in a way, it mentally compartmentalizes all the abuse, the manipulation, the pain, the control. And it gives women this false sense of freedom that, okay, it's okay for her to go down this road and explore all these types of sexual activities because she didn't choose this. She just signed the gag order and she just got reeled in and it was against her will kind of from the beginning. But of course, her will evolves and there's just so many intricacies and nuances and layers to it that I can so easily see how women have gotten sucked into this. But I so want to see them, again, have that filter for truth and to know that this type of relationship involving this type of abuse would so never, ever, ever be healthy. And maybe it's not even healthy for us to be reading it. You know, if you have a tendency to be lured into different, various mindsets that go against the grain of your spiritual values, such as sex outside of marriage, such as using sex to manipulate or to control someone rather than to build a genuine intimate bond in a marriage relationship, you probably will find this trilogy rather shocking and offensive and disheartening. And I love hearing women say that they picked it up just out of curiosity, but they put it down because it just so didn't ring true with their sexual or with their spiritual values. I think that we all have to do that. We have to use discernment on what we want to expose ourselves to.
What's the big difference? I mean, we all have obviously sexual fantasies, sexual thoughts, men and women alike. So where can we put that filter in place? I mean, is all fantasy bad, or is there a way we can use it to serve a healthy purpose in our marriages?
Absolutely. And God wired our brains to fantasize for a reason. And I unpacked 7 different reasons in the fantasy fallacy, but just kind of to give a quick overview, fantasy can numb us to unbearable pain. And I think especially children who are being abused, as when they're very young, their brain goes somewhere else because they can't handle how overwhelming what they're actually experiencing is. Fantasy can alleviate extreme boredom. It can motivate us toward an established goal for our future, like losing weight or finishing a degree or something like that. We fantasize about what it's going to be like when we get there. It can help us prepare for a life transition. Like I've been fantasizing about an empty nest ever since my teenagers started driving. And now here we are. We just got our empty nest and we're living out the fantasy of, okay, we said that this was going to be great. And this was going to be a new era in our sex life. And it has been. It's been wonderful. So the list could go on and on. So we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, it's wrong to fantasize about anything. You have to stay totally in the moment. Because I think that fantasy can actually be very healthy in a marriage relationship. For example, women whose husbands are deployed overseas, they will email me and say, is it okay if I fantasize about having sex with my husband when he comes home? And it's like, why in the world would that not be? That's how you're going to keep the home fires burning. That's how you're going to be eager for his return home. There was a gentleman who emailed and said, now that we're much older and we're struggling with issues of erectile dysfunction and postmenopausal issues, he said, one of the things I really love to fantasize about is what sex was like when we were much younger and none of these issues plague us at all. And he said, is that wrong to just rewind the tape a few decades? And I thought, why would that be wrong? The Bible tells us to delight in the wife of our youth. So if thinking about what it was like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, floats your boat and helps you cross the finish line, why not? So I don't want to throw all fantasy out the window and say this is a horrible, horrible thing. But when we start fantasizing about other people with, actual identities. Obviously women fantasize about a particular role, like they'll fantasize about an older authority figure. Well, that usually indicates that there are some father issues in her life. Men will frequently fantasize about a much younger woman who's really, really nice to him. Well, that's usually an indicator of some mother issues that still haven't been resolved. So when you put an actual person, a face, and an identity in that role in your fantasy mind, and you start thinking of them in the act of making love with your spouse, that's a big red flag that you're not with your spouse right now. Mentally, you're with that other person. And I don't think that that's really the best strategy for building the intimacy and the energy that you want to have between you and your spouse.
Yeah. And you're fantasizing about another situation, another person. And it makes me think, and again, it kind of goes back to maybe one of those double standards that just kind of leapt out at me when I was doing the research for this interview. It's very common to hear wives in counseling talk about the husband watches pornography or went to strip clubs when he was younger, and then he expects her to act out those fantasies or those scenes.
Right.
He wants her to become them. But when I read that the sale of whips and nipple clamps, all these things have went up with the 50 Shades of Grey, well, I know it's women buying it. Mm-hmm. And men aren't reading the book. Men have no idea this fantasy's in this woman's head. And how many men are coming home, vanilla men coming home and to find their wives with a whip, right, wanting to beat them or be beat. And they have no idea where this is coming from or what's going on. And I think women should understand at least that is really, to me, I would say, no different than the man watching the porn and then expecting the woman to live up to these video standards.
That is a great point, Scott. That is a really great point. Yeah, the notion that women are thinking that this is what my husband actually wants, or this is even what I want. What I suspect happens with the sale of all these products is that women try them one time and realize that, okay, this really doesn't do anything for me. But
this hurts.
Exactly. That I'd rather have the pleasure than the pain. Let's just take the pain out of the equation. But I do think that there is a small segment of society that this really is their fantasy. This really is something that creates a lot of pleasure in their brains when they experience it. And again, the reason is because it's recreating a scenario, but they win this time. So, for example, someone who has been severely physically abused back in their childhood, they may actually enjoy the opportunity to recreate that danger and that dynamic, but this time they're actually in control, and they say when the pain has gone far enough and they can stop it. And so it gives them that sense of power and control that they felt robbed of as a child. But the problem is that your spouse may not be on that same page with you. And I think that anything that one person fantasizes about that the other partner, that the spouse feels offended by or scared of, that I just don't think that anything should ever be forced on the spouse for the sake of your own pleasure. And again, reverse those roles. If a man was forcing his wife to do something because he finds it pleasurable, but she finds it degrading or scary or painful or offensive, that would never fly. So why are women making the assumption that men should just become their little sexual plaything and they should just get to do whatever they want with their husbands? I think that he definitely needs to have a say in what direction the fantasy goes in your marriage relationship.
You know, it seems that you've said this a few times, like you said that people bring you into their churches to have these talks, that we don't see a lot of it or hear a lot of it from the pulpits. I agree with that 100%. That's one of the reasons I had Dr. Doug Rosenall on the show.
Love Doug. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a friend of mine.
Was awesome. Because wanted to talk about that, because we don't talk about it enough in the church. But it seems like, and I wonder if you could tell me maybe from a counselor standpoint or what have you, your professional opinion, if, you know, we see a lot of, it's very common, it just seems like, that a lot of respectable Christian leaders, when we hear about them getting trouble, and I guess it's the same worldwide, it doesn't have to be Christians, that'd be everybody, but it always seems to be money and sex are the two areas that they seem to fall in, finances and sexual. And as Christians, especially as ministers and pastors, you would think we would kind of be above this. Do you have any take on, you know, I always hear it's because we don't talk about it, because there's repression. Do you have any you want to chime in on that, or why you think that might happen? And if it happens in the pulpits, are we all at risk for it down in the pews? Or
Oh, absolutely. And I definitely think that leaders are particularly vulnerable, and especially male leaders, because women grow up with so many fathers from daddies who are just too busy, too distracted, don't know what to do with the girl, that they don't know how to meet that daughter's emotional needs. So they grow up so hungry for attention and affection from men. I know this is certainly my story, that when I worked with a counselor and looked at my sexual history from the ages of 15 to 20 years old, there were so many partners, and they were all significantly older than me and in some form of authority over me. And that told me that I was looking for a father figure. So you have all these women sitting out in the audience looking at this man in the pulpit. He may as well be on a pedestal. And, you know, he's eloquent, and he seems to be very spiritually and emotionally available from the tone of his sermon. And he's a spiritual leader. And sometimes they're looking at their husbands going, why aren't you a spiritual leader like that in our own home? But there's just so many negative comparisons going on. And so they are particularly vulnerable to having women project their own hunger onto them and looking at them as the fulfillment of what they crave. But what they, what they really lost along the way is in their relationship with their dad. It's not in their relationship with their pastor or their boss or their professor or whatever. But I also want to say that with the whole repression thing, the word picture that came to my mind when I was writing Fantasy Fallacy is that of a beach ball. That, a beach ball resting on the surface of the water It's very calm and very serene. And I liken that to, you know what? We are sexual beings, and we are wired to have sexual thoughts and sexual feelings and even sexual fantasies. But as long as we're channeling all that energy strictly into our marriage relationship, with no one else, then it's resting safely on the water. It's not going to hurt anyone. But when you try to force that beach ball down to the bottom of the pool, in other words, repress all your sexual thoughts and feelings and fantasies because you feel so guilty that they're even in your head in the first place, which that's totally false guilt. Even Jesus himself was tempted in every way, and that includes sexually. And how can you be tempted if you don't even have a thought or a feeling? So we can know that Jesus was he had sexual thoughts and feelings. But when we try to repress those and not even enjoy intimacy to the fullest in our marriage relationship, what happens is that if we aren't keeping pressure squarely on top of that ball, what's going to happen if we tilt just a little to the right or the left and under the right circumstances? We put ourselves in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person or whatever. That beach ball goes soaring up, not just to the surface of the water where it belongs, but skyrockets up into the sky and then comes crashing back down and creates a lot of ripple effects. And that's what we see every time a pastor falls from grace, is he was most likely repressing some things. And then it comes just, exploding up and hurts a lot of people in the process. And so one of my best recommendations is if you're in any type of spiritual leadership whatsoever, or even any type of leadership with women at all, like college professors, or if you have female employees, reading the fantasy fallacy and helping you understand that whole dynamic would be absolutely vital. As I was writing the manuscript, I had several professional counselors and pastors reading it along with me. And what I kept hearing them say over and over is, why didn't I learn all this about fantasy in seminary? Why didn't I learn this when I was working on my master's or my PhD? And the reality is there hasn't been a lot of teaching on where mental fantasy comes from, the purpose that it serves, how it can be a good thing in our life, how we can protect it from being a bad thing in our life. And so I'm hoping to usher in a whole new wave of conversations in the church. And if the 50 Shades of Grey trilogy is what it took to open lines of communication, then I have to be grateful for at least that element of it, because what Satan intends for evil, God can totally use for good. We see that over and over in scripture and throughout history.
Yeah. And I think your book addresses this, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what you're saying is it's a balance, because not only this repression that you just discussed, but as you were talking about that, I was thinking about the other side, going to the other extreme.
Expressing it.
Expressing the fantasy or letting the fantasies go so far, because like recently I've had Brittany Ruiz on the show, who was formerly Jenna Presley, a top nominated female porn star who is now born again Christian. And just last week I had the Hookers for Jesus, Annie Lobert, who was a professional call girl, high-end escort for a number of years. And when you talk to these young ladies who worked in the industry, there is nothing fantastic about their lives or their fantasies behind that curtain. And so I think for the women and the men, the way you let your train of thoughts go, I think the mind definitely writes checks that reality could never cash. And that's just as dangerous as repressing it.
Absolutely. And my philosophy has always been that fantasy is much better than reality. You can't go acting out certain fantasies and expect it to totally scratch your itch. It's going to be disappointing, because it's kind of like watching the movie after you've read the book. And as you were reading the book, you were able to envision the characters exactly like what you wanted them to look like and sound like and act like. But when you're watching the movie, someone is dictating that for you. It's the same way. Our fantasies really are a way to experience, that sexual fulfillment. But when we start acting certain things out, it just becomes really, really destructive. But let me also say, though, Scott, I want to communicate to married couples out there that if there's a particular sexual fantasy that you find arousing and you make that suggestion to your spouse and they're in no way offended by it, maybe even intrigued by it, and you want to act that out, if it doesn't involve anyone else, if it doesn't involve pornography, if it doesn't involve breaking the law in any way, such as like sex in public or something like that, if it's not going to bring any harm to anyone, then I want them to feel that freedom, because marriage is the place where you're safe to be to be yourself and to be completely honest and open about who you are and what you think and floats your boat. But if spouse in any way disagrees with that or is concerned about that or is feels inhibited by that, we have to honor and respect our spouse's feelings. We can't just railroad our spouse into doing things that they don't feel good about, because if you destroy the trust in your relationship, you're destroying intimacy as well, because you just can't have intimacy without total trust between a husband and a wife.
Okay. Now, earlier I said, I'm just curious what you're going to say about this. I kind of made a comparison to the women reading this book and wanting the men to act out this role of Christian Grey to being the same as a man watching internet video porn, expecting his wife to live up to that. And the term mommy porn kind of came on my radar with this 50 Shades of Grey. Seemed to got a lot of publicity using that word. But these type of books, do you think they're healthy or unhealthy? Are they as dangerous as I know internet video porn is for men and for the girls who participate in it, the actresses? But are these books dangerous?
I think that's according to whose hands they're in. I think that these are going to be very, very dangerous to young, impressionable women who really don't understand, the dynamics of what a man is really looking for. There's so many women who think that the wilder she is, the more attractive she's going to be. But the reality is that guys are probably looking at her as, hey, you'd be a great hookup, but you're not marriage material. I'm not taking you home to mama. And so the notion that women can use these type of tactics and lure a guy in for a marriage relationship and it's going to end in hearts and flowers and happily ever after, yes, it's dangerous in her hands. But yet I've talked to older, mature women who've been married for decades, and they, maybe they've read this book out of curiosity to see, what is this new cultural phenomenon? Maybe they're in positions of leadership over women, and they want to be educated about how to guide women, and so they want to, be aware of what this storyline is really all about. And, they have said to me, I don't feel as if this has negatively impacted my marriage because I know where the boundary lines are. So I think that it's just, according to how mature the reader is and what is the purpose that you're reading it for. If you're reading it for tips on how to conduct your life and relationships, you're doomed. But if you're looking at it through the lens of how can I help women understand, what's healthy and not healthy in a relationship, then this is actually a good springboard off of which to minister to women, because a lot of them are exposing themselves to it. But Scott, for people who are really, really curious, but they don't want to expose themselves to the book, and again, I just so applaud that self-restraint, I created something that they can access at shannonethridge.com. It's a 7-page synopsis of the entire trilogy, so that I tell you what happened. It's kind of like the Cliff Notes version without you having to expose yourself to all of the graphic language and the graphic sex scenes. And then there's also some questions for discussion so that people can feel equipped to have conversations in our society, with your hairdresser or with your best friend or, whoever, so that you don't feel ignorant and totally, like you're hiding under a rock or have your head in the sand, but you're protecting yourself from exposing or from getting exposed to things that you just don't want in your head.
Okay. And we've only got time for maybe one or two more questions, and I hate to hit you with a shotgun approach, but there's just so many things I want to talk about, jumping around that are in your book and that you bring out in your book. One of the things that I'm just curious to get a quick insight from you on is kind of the same-sex thoughts and attractions. And that's a whole nother show, I know, and we could get into, the whole, it's a big topic in the church right now, especially.
It is such a controversial topic, but definitely one that we have to talk about.
Well, I'm curious as to what you would say about, I've heard, that, like we say that marijuana is the gateway drug to cocaine and heroin. I've heard a lot of people talk about that, straight men or straight women, they start to explore these fantasies and they go to the extreme and they go too far with them. And that is a lot of time where same-sex thoughts and attractions, or, even getting into the S&M and the violence in these things, because it just is not satisfying enough anymore. And it's just like they have to keep going deeper and further.
Right.
Do you think there's truth to that?
Well, certainly no lust is ever satisfying, and there's no man or woman on the planet that can totally, totally satisfy you. But to keep all your sexual energies harnessed within the marriage relationship is absolutely vital. But I know that there's some people many people who wrestle with the same-sex fantasy and they wonder, how did this even get started? Does this mean that I'm really gay and I just need to come out of the closet like I've been told by Oprah and Ellen and, all these daytime talk show hosts? Let me just give you a quick case study that I think will really drive home the points that we've been talking about throughout the show and give you some insight as to why people often have these types of fantasies. There was a 31-year-old woman who approached me for coaching, and she said that she was struggling with the fact that even though she's married and has a baby girl and they want to have more kids, that the only way that she could experience orgasm is through entertaining lesbian fantasies in her head. And she felt really, guilty about this. She just felt embarrassed and ashamed about this. She had never told anyone until she shared it with me. And I said, well, let's do a sexual history to figure out where this thought may come from. But I couldn't see anything in her sexual history that was like, big red flag. This is where, it started. But then it was like God said, you know what, do a broader history, find out what else has happened in her life. And so we did a life mapping exercise where I saw the highs and lows. And what I learned is that when she was 14 years old, she had an 11-year-old sister who went to spend the night with friends. And that night, lightning struck the roof of that house and it burned to the ground. And everyone inside was killed, including her sister. And as a result, her mother emotionally shut down. She became a walking zombie. And I asked Cindy, I said, what kind of counseling did you get to cope with the grief of the loss of your only sibling? Crickets. She had never gone through counseling. I said, what kind of counseling did your parents go through to deal with their loss? Nothing. And I said, do you understand that your lesbian fantasies are really just your brain's way of trying to heal itself from this past trauma that at a very pivotal age in your sexual development, you lost the two females closest to you, your sister physically and your mother emotionally. And it was like ripping the carpet underneath her feet. And she just didn't have that female to female intimacy that she had grown so accustomed to. So the fantasies were really nothing more than her longing for a recreation of that intimacy with her sister and even with her mom. And I asked her, I said, I know that you've begged God to deliver you from this, to take this thorn out of your side. But what if he doesn't? What if this is your cross to bear? What if you're just never going to be able to experience orgasm without entertaining the thought of another woman? And she said, now that I understand the root of it, it doesn't scare me nearly as bad. And I know that I will be delivered from this on the other side of heaven when I'm reunited with my sister. And she said, my only concern is I feel like I need to be honest with my husband and find out if he feels that he's being betrayed, that I'm being unfaithful to him. And so we brought her husband in for a session. We explained the nature of fantasy and how it's the brain's way of trying to heal itself from past trauma. And he certainly knew about her sister. And he just looked at her very sweetly and said, when you explain it that way, it makes total sense. And I am so not offended by that. And he said, and I will never take advantage of that because, there are some men on the planet that if they find out that their wives fantasize in that direction, well, let me see what woman I can reel in for a threesome, But he wanted to protect her. He didn't want to take advantage of her, but he didn't want her to feel as if she was being unfaithful to him. And so just the compassion that was shown was so beautiful, and the deeper levels of intimacy. Again, intimacy is intimacy. And so he saw into her innermost thoughts and feelings, and he was not offended. He did not feel betrayed, and he was able to offer her a love and compassion that made her feel all the more secure in her marriage relationship.
Well, Shannon, kind of as a way of parting, I'm thinking about that story you just told, and there's probably a lot of people going to listen to this show who might be having thoughts, who might feel guilty, who might be anxious about what they're thinking or struggling with in their head. So what I'd like you to do is maybe give them some, because not all of them are going to be able to sit down and counsel with you. They should see counselors for sure.
Sure.
But give them some encouraging words of advice, and then let them know how they can reach out and connect with you, whether it be via internet or your books on Amazon or however you'd like them to connect with you.
Sure. Well, I just want to remind them that a sexual thought, you can't protect yourself from every sexual thought. Martin Luther said, you can't keep a bird from flying over your head, but you can keep him from building a nest there. And so sexual thoughts and the feelings that come from having those sexual thoughts, that comes part and parcel with being human, and you will not be delivered from that until the day that you die. But we don't need to obsess over whether this is sin or not. Even Jesus himself was tempted in these exact sort of ways, but he was without sin. In other words, it's what we choose to do with these thoughts and feelings. Channeling all of our sexual energy into the marriage relationship exclusively the way that God intended and designed, that is a healthy response. Acting out on them is where you would put your foot across the line and get sucked into, sin always takes you places where you don't want to go. And so if you're someone who is really wrestling with God, wrestling with, why do I have these thoughts? Why do I have these temptations? Why do I experience these feelings when these particular thoughts come to mind? And you need help, exploring that territory. I offer these 4-day intensive workshops called Women at the Well workshops, where me and 8 women gather together in my living room for a 4-day span of time. And that's exactly what we do. We take off our mask. We get really real with each other. We share our life's journeys with each other. We explore some of the negative emotions and traumas that we've experienced, and they figure out where their fantasies are actually rooted. And then they can go on to, to try to get some counseling and healing, beyond that if needed. But they can learn more about Women at the Well workshops and the Fantasy Fallacy book at shannonethridge.com.
Thank you so much for your time today. And thank you there at the end for plugging and using the phrase wrestling with God.
You bet. It's a great expression. We all do.
Thanks again, Shannon.
Scott, thank you so much for what you're doing. Keep up the God work, friend.
Will do. That's it for today's show. Shoot me a tweet or an email. There's even a voicemail option on the side of the page at grapplerschurch.tv. And let me know if you have read this book. Let me know if you're going to the film. Are you taking your husband or wife? Or do you find it repulsive and convicting and think Christians shouldn't? I really value your opinion no matter where you sit on this topic. I'd like to know what your thoughts are. Please help support this show by purchasing Wrestling with God or Born to Raise Hell by myself, both of those books, Scott Blair. You can find those on Amazon Kindle just by searching for the title or for the name. It is a tremendous help. Something else that helps a lot as well, more than I think you imagine, because if you knew, more of you would be doing it. But when you leave good reviews on iTunes for this podcast, when you leave good reviews on those books, it makes a world of difference, and it helps get exposure not only to this show and to our books, but to all of the ministers and their books and their ministries that are on this show, and it gets them more exposure. And I think they're highly intelligent and godly and incredible guests, and what they have to say really contributes and adds to the kingdom. And I think they all need more exposure, every single one of them. So that's what it does when you leave reviews on iTunes and the other places. It really blesses those ministries and helps me grow this thing. Last but not least, the other thing that you could do to support this show is to go visit those sponsors that I mentioned at the beginning of every show and let them know where you heard about them. You can connect with me on Twitter or Facebook by using the handle Grapplers Church. That's one word, GRAPPLERS Church. Grapplers Church, one word. Until next time, Grapplers Church fam, let's grab a hold of God and not let go.